So this is chapter 45 on the endocrine system, and we're just going to look at 45.1 and 45.2. So essentially what we want to be looking at is how does the body regulate homeostasis? And primarily the endocrine system is going to be the control system for maintaining the body's homeostasis. So why are hormones needed? Hormones are part of the endocrine system, and they're the chemical messengers that travel from one body part to another. They're a means of communication in order to coordinate the whole body's functioning, and they're involved in daily homeostasis and the regulation of large-scale changes. So some examples of that regulation include maintaining different solute levels in the blood, like your glucose levels or your calcium ions, salts, even osmolarity, the amount of water in your blood system. Also the regulation of metabolism or of growth, either of cells or of the person in general, in terms of development, maturation, and reproduction. Those are all going to be controlled by the endocrine system. So we're going to take a look at a video by your textbook, Pearson's video here, or BioFlix, on just an example of how blood sugar is regulated and homeostasis is maintained.
The sugary snack you devour enters your digestive system and is broken down to simple sugars like glucose. Glucose enters the bloodstream, causing an increase in blood glucose levels. But various mechanisms bring blood glucose back down to its normal level, the set point. This is an example of homeostasis, the body's tendency to maintain relatively constant internal conditions. Hormones produced by the pancreas regulate blood glucose levels. Let's zoom in. When blood glucose levels are high, glucose molecules leave the blood and enter beta cells in the pancreas. The beta cells respond by releasing the hormone insulin. Insulin enters the bloodstream and is transported to cells all over the body. Let's see what happens in the liver. Insulin binds to receptors on liver cells. This causes the cells to take in more glucose. Inside the liver cells, glucose is converted to glycogen, a storage molecule. Blood glucose levels decrease as glucose is taken up by liver cells and other body cells. As a result, less and less insulin is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. This is an example of how negative feedback maintains homeostasis. What happens if you've skipped lunch and your blood glucose levels are low? Let's zoom into the pancreas again. When blood glucose levels are low, alpha cells in the pancreas release the hormone glucagon. Glucagon enters the bloodstream and acts on target cells in the liver. Glucagon binds to receptors on the liver cells, signaling the liver cells to break glycogen down to glucose. Glucose is released. And blood glucose levels increase. As a result, less glucagon is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. In this way, two hormones with opposing effects allow the body to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In diabetes, the body is unable to maintain homeostasis homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In type 1 diabetes, the beta cells of the pancreas are destroyed by the immune system, and so no insulin is produced. In type 2 diabetes, the pancreas produces insulin, but target cells do not take up glucose. In both types of diabetes, when blood glucose levels rise, cells do not take up the additional glucose, and so blood glucose remains high. This example shows the importance of homeostasis in everyone's life.
So we're going to take a look at how that system actually works. You should be pretty familiar now with the regulation of blood glucose between the POGOL that you worked on in that presentation just now. But let's look at some more details. So first of all, animals rely on two systems for maintaining homeostasis. The two systems that interplay and work together are the endocrine system and the nervous system. So the endocrine system is defined as a system of ductless glands that secrete chemical signals directly into the blood. Those chemicals travel to target tissues or cells, and target cells have receptor proteins that are going to receive those signals. The endocrine system gets a slow, long-lasting response. The nervous system works through a system of neurons, which we would call a dedicated pathway. And they transmit electrical signals. They release neurotransmitters to the target tissue in order to get the response of, for example, releasing a neurotransmitter like acetylcholine to a muscle tissue to get a response. These types of responses occur quickly, so we have a fast, short-lasting response. So again, hormones are needed to coordinate slower but longer acting responses, like a reaction to stress or dehydration or low blood sugar. Hormones also regulate long-term developmental processes that take time and are better done in a slow way. They do this by informing different parts of the body how fast to grow or when to grow and develop. Hormone-secreting organs are called endocrine glands, and they're referred to as ductless because they secrete their chemical messengers directly into extracellular fluid, and from there the chemicals diffuse into the circulatory system. So regulation by chemical messengers can occur either by way of hormones or by neurotransmitters. So we've already studied the nervous system, and you should be familiar with how neurotransmitters are going to go from cell to cell. But hormones are also chemical messengers, and what they share in common is that there is some sort of receptor that's going to receive them as a signal. So they become a ligand binding to a receptor to get a response, whether they're a neurotransmitter or a hormone. We break hormones into two broad categories, either protein-based or lipid-based, which means they're either going to be water-soluble or they're not. So the protein-based hormones, actually there are three types. There's a polypeptide, which is a small protein, and examples of this are insulin and ADH. There are glycoproteins, which are just larger proteins with a carbohydrate attached. And these are, some examples are FSH and LH, which are involved in a woman's reproductive system. And then we have amines, which are single amino acids that function as a hormone. So melatonin and epinephrine are examples of amine hormones. And then our lipid-based hormones are made up of steroids. And a steroid, again, going back to our biochemistry unit, is a modified cholesterol molecule. And examples of this are sex hormones, aldosterone, testosterone. So steroids are something that we'll look at in how they work as opposed to these protein-based hormones. So how do they act on the target cells? Hormones are going to reach all parts of the body. So they're going to get into the circulatory system, and then they're going to circulate around the body, but they're only going to act where they can find a receptor for their action. And again, remember that a receptor is something that's going to be very specific for a specific molecule. So hormones are going to be exposed to, or every cell in the body is going to be exposed to a hormone, but only the cells with the receptor are actually going to get a response. So how do these receptors, or where they're located, is determined by the type of hormone that we have. So if it's a lipid-based hormone, that means it's hydrophobic. It also means that it can travel through the cell membrane. It will diffuse directly across the cell membrane and enter into the cytoplasm of a cell. And within the cell, then, there are going to be receptor proteins, either in the cytoplasm or within the nucleus itself, or both. And essentially, almost all lipid-based hormones are going to bind to DNA as a transcription factor and turn genes on for transcription and the production of a protein. Now this is going to be different from a protein-based hormone, because protein-based hormones, as we know, proteins are hydrophilic. They're not lipid soluble. They will not pass directly through the cell membrane. So because they cannot diffuse across the cell membrane, they have to bind to receptor proteins on top of the cell membrane outside of the cell. So they're going to trigger a secondary messenger pathway, and then that pathway will activate internal cellular response. And that could be anything from the activation of an enzyme to the uptake or secretion of other molecules. So these types of hormones are going to get a much broader response or type of response. So this next is going to show you just a graphic showing the different types of signaling that we get. So we define endocrine signaling as signaling that has occurred throughout the entire body. So a hormone is secreted into the extracellular fluid by an endocrine cell, and then it diffuses into the bloodstream and circulates throughout the body. So it's a long distance signal. In contrast, we have paracrine and autocrine signaling, which are going to get a response nearby the cell. And what distinguishes these two is that paracrine signaling is going to send out a hormone signal that's going to work on an adjacent cell. So some cells that are nearby the original. I don't know why that happened. That's in contrast to autocrine, which is easy, auto meaning self, where the messenger hormone actually has its action back on the cell that released it. So in autocrine signaling, the target cell is the secreting cell, and in paracrine, the target cell is a nearby neighboring cell. This is a diagram that shows synaptic signaling versus neuroendocrine signaling, and we're actually going to come back to that picture. I think that's a little bit premature. But this one is closely aligned to what we've been talking about. You can see here the action of a water-soluble hormone, which is passing through the cell membrane and into the nucleus in order to regulate the transcription of genes, versus a lipid-soluble